Welcome to Nighttime History. I hope you sleep well to this story. On November 22, 1963, in Dallas, Texas, the world shifted in an instant. The morning was bright, the air crisp, the streets full of waving families and office workers leaning from windows. John F. Kennedy rode in an open limousine, shoulders loose, smile easy, Jackie beside him in the pink suit that would become a marker of grief. Motorcycles flanked the car, agents scanned the roofs. The route curved toward a small green called Dealey Plaza. Then the first crack. A second. A third. The plaza folded into panic. Hands flew to mouths, some people dropped to the grass, others stared upward hunting for angles and windows. The presidential car surged toward Parkland Hospital, a thunder of engines and shouted directions. Within the hour, a figure in a briefcase stepped to a microphone and told the nation their president was dead. Certainty arrived quickly. Authorities identified a suspect, Lee Harvey Oswald, an ex-Marine with a tangled path through the Cold War, a man who had lived in the Soviet Union, returned with a Russian wife, handed out pro-Castro leaflets in New Orleans, and worked, by chance or design, in the Texas school book depository. The tale was simple. A cheap rifle. A sixth-floor window. 3 shots. A lone gunman and a nation unmoored. But simple stories often crumble under weight. The more you look at Dallas, the more the grain shows. Witness accounts that disagree, evidence that behaves like a stage prop, procedures that bend at precisely the wrong moments. You can polish a surface, but the knots in the wood remain. Start with the bullet that came to be called Commission Exhibit 399, the magic bullet. A label that sounds like a joke until you study the geometry. Officially, this single projectile entered the president's upper back, exited through his throat, then drove into the back of Texas Governor John Connally, shattered a rib, exited his chest, smashed through his wrist, and finally lodged in his thigh. 7 wounds in 2 men, credited to 1 round. By the laws of materials and trauma, such a bullet should have been chewed and warped by bone, pressed into a new, ugly shape by the tasks assigned to it. And yet, when the bullet turned up at Parkland Hospital, it looked nearly pristine, as if it had been fired into water or cotton and then set carefully on a clean metal tray. Photographs show a neat, almost polite piece of evidence, the kind that fits into a narrative without catching on the edges. Doctors who treated Connally doubted it. Hunters who had seen rounds chew bone doubted it. Soldiers who had watched ammunition deform in real time doubted it. If that single bullet did not carve the full path assigned to it, then the arithmetic changes. More wounds demand more metal. More metal means more shots. More shots means we are no longer dealing with 1 rifle and 1 window. Then there is the theater of the wallets. 45 minutes after the shots in Dealey Plaza, Officer J.D. Tippit was shot in Oak Cliff. At the scene, a wallet appeared, containing identification for Lee Harvey Oswald and for Alec Heidel, the alias linked to the mail-order rifle. Meanwhile, a wallet tied to Oswald turned up at the depository. And when Oswald was arrested at the Texas Theater, yet another wallet became part of the file. Not 1 or 2 but at least 3 wallets, all pointing to the same man with marvelous efficiency. It is possible, of course, for a suspect to scatter clues the way a careless traveler scatters ticket stubs. It is also possible to overdecorate a story, to plant too many breadcrumbs, and to leave the audience wondering who arranged the trail. Crowds remember sounds. In Dealey Plaza, many witnesses told police they heard more than 3 shots, 4, even 5, a staccato pattern bouncing off masonry and the echoing underpass. Several swore that at least 1 report came from the grassy knoll ahead and to the right of the president's car. A railroad worker described a puff of smoke curling above the fence line at the exact instant of impact. Others saw men moving quickly away from that area, their steps intent and their faces tilted down. The official narrative gathered these voices and sorted them into the boxes labeled confusion and echo and stress. But their persistence, over decades, feels less like noise and more like a stubborn melody. Chain of custody, the dull backbone of any homicide case, also bent. Texas law required the autopsy in Dallas, yet the president's body was rushed onto Air Force One and flown to Bethesda. Parkland doctors described a large wound at the back of the head that suggested a frontal hit. The Bethesda autopsy emphasized shots from behind. Photographs went missing, others looked oddly framed. Measurements wandered like numbers kept in pencil. In an ordinary murder trial, such handling would salt the earth for the prosecution. Here it became part of the national fog. Oswald's biography reads like a dossier curated for plausibility. He defected to the USSR and returned. He worked odd jobs but sought the heat of ideology. He argued loudly in public and lived quietly in small rooms. Depending on which page you read, he was either the precise profile of a volatile loner or the perfect cutout for someone else's plan. After the shots, a supervisor saw him calm in a second-floor break room with a soda only moments after the last echo faded. Could a man hide a rifle, descend the stairs, and arrive that composed in such a small slice of time? Tests and reenactments say maybe. The human heart says that kind of calm belongs to another story. 2 days later, the narrative sealed itself with a gunshot in a basement. Jack Ruby, nightclub owner, impulsive, connected, stepped into the lane of cameras and shot Oswald in the stomach on live television. He said he did it to spare Jackie a trial, a chivalrous story that sounded tidy enough for the front page. But Ruby knew policemen and hustlers and men who spoke in code. With one squeeze of a trigger, the only person positioned to contradict or complicate the lone gunman tale was gone. What makes the whole story feel staged is not any single piece of evidence but the timing and texture of all of them together. The rifle with prints. The backyard photographs of Oswald holding weapons like a catalog pose. The useful alias. The bus transfer. The theater seat. The wallets. The trail is so immaculate you can mistake it for truth. Real life, however, frays. It leaves loose threads and uneasy coincidences. This case offers coincidences by the basket, and many of them point in the same direction. Ask the thriller's oldest question: who benefits? The answers spread outward like cracks. Kennedy had angered the CIA after the Bay of Pigs and had spoken about changing the way intelligence power was used. He had signaled a desire to wind down involvement in Vietnam. His brother, the Attorney General, pressed the mob with a zeal that ignored the informal treaties of previous years. Lyndon Johnson, shadowed by scandal, became president with a Bible on Air Force One. Defense contractors saw expansion where a different policy might have signaled contraction. Exile groups who wanted Castro gone yesterday saw caution where they expected fire. Everyone had a motive. Only one man was named. None of this proves a conspiracy. It draws the outline of one, a silhouette against a bright wall. But silhouettes are persuasive at night. Look again at Dealey Plaza. Buildings arranged like wings, an open rise that functions like a gallery, an underpass that scatters sound and sight. The route slowed there. The car presented a predictable target. The geometry felt chosen. The Zapruder film, that brief and terrible home movie, became the nation's dark metronome. Frame by frame, the country taught itself to read spatter and recoil, to count seconds, to make private physics out of public grief. Some saw in the frames proof of shots from behind. Others saw a violent snap that could only have been driven from the front. Grainy 8mm became a mirror that reflected the viewer's prior belief. Return to Bethesda. Autopsy notes hint at revisions. Doctors disagree about entrance versus exit, beveling and trajectory. Measurements that should anchor the case drift a centimeter or two depending on who holds the ruler. Photographs that could settle arguments are missing, or exist in versions with mysterious differences. The most consequential medical examination of the 20th century arrived at conclusions, but its scaffolding creaks. Meanwhile, the Tippit killing reads like a side plot that refuses to stay secondary. The officer stops, words pass, shots erupt. Witness descriptions of the shooter's clothing vary. The chain from shells to bullets to gun is presented as firm, then hedged with caveats. A discarded jacket turns up. The wallet with the double identity appears as if conjured. The taxi and bus routes Oswald allegedly took are plausible, but the decision to head toward a theater rather than away from police attention feels like a line written for symbolism rather than escape. Oswald's day is a clock with extra hands. A bag said to hold a disassembled rifle is measured and debated. Fibers match in ways that feel a little too proud of themselves. A housekeeper remembers footsteps or a glance. A coworker does or does not recall a conversation. Every small detail, harmless in isolation, begins to contribute to a single chord, the noise of a story that wants to be believed. Motives can be mapped a dozen ways. Draw lines to Miami and to Havana, where exiles nurse fury against Castro and against any American leader who seemed hesitant. Draw lines to Chicago and New Orleans, where the mob watched an administration they thought they understood begin to dismantle their arrangements. Draw lines to Langley and to the Pentagon, where men with sharp pencils preferred predictability to idealism. Draw a dotted line to Dallas, a city whose elite had iced the political air. None of these is proof. Together they make a climate. If you prefer the simpler version, you can say Oswald wanted to matter and made himself the hinge of a century. He practiced, he bought a rifle under an alias, he brought it to work, he took his shot, and institutions, shocked into error, made unavoidable mistakes. That version asks us to accept an Olympic run of coincidences, a single bullet behaving like a gymnast, witnesses who misheard the direction of sound as a group, an autopsy bent by urgency, a suspect coincidentally trailed by wallets and aliases, a killer of that suspect who just happened to arrive in a police basement at the right second with the right excuse. Possible, yes. Demanding, too. What lingers is the sensation of choreography. The plaza. The angles. The slowing car. The race to Parkland. The rush to Bethesda. The perfectly incriminating exhibits. The sudden murder of the alleged assassin. The commission and its book, followed by another committee and another book that pried the lid back open. It reads in acts, with curtains that rise and fall on cue. And if it reads in acts, then someone wrote the script, or several someones wrote overlapping drafts, and the production that opened on November 22nd used pieces of them all. You can populate the writer's room with mobsters, exiles, spies, careerists, patriots of a harsher creed, or bitter men who thought they were saving the country from a young president's learning curve. The casting matters less than the shared willingness to move from preference to plan. Intent alone doesn't move a bullet. People do. People who understand sight lines and speed, who know when a route forces a car to slow, who can place assets and walk away. People who know which documents to highlight and which to misfile, who can make a chain of custody look official and keep it from being reliable. People who can sit under lights afterward and sound very sure, because sounding sure often wins the first month of history. Half a century later, the case reads like an X-ray of the American appetite for answers. Some want a bold, solitary line that explains everything. Others want the mess that says nothing was ever coordinated. Dallas offers neither. It offers transparencies laid on top of one another that never quite align. You can see through each sheet, and yet the composite refuses to resolve. So you return to the beginning. A bright morning, a smiling man in a limousine, a plaza arranged like a small amphitheater, and a handful of seconds that reordered a century. You follow the papers and the hearings, the analyses and the television specials, and you realize that the most American artifact of the day might be the argument that followed, ingenious, relentless, and unwilling to forget. If there was a setup, it does not cancel the courage or the chaos of ordinary people who tried to help. It does suggest the stage was dressed in advance, angles studied, stories drafted, exits rehearsed. That is why the question survives. It isn't morbid curiosity. It is proportionality. Events of this consequence deserve explanations that match their weight. And if there wasn't a setup, reality is stranger than suspicion, demanding that we accept a chain of chance so precise that it looks like intention from every angle. That possibility is unsettling in its own way. History toppled by a man with a mail-order rifle and a window at the right corner of a building on the right minute of the right day. Either way, Dealey Plaza remains a place where echoes live. You can measure distances, triangulate angles, time stairwells and elevators. You can pin photographs to corkboard with red string. When you finish, you still have a story with a missing piece, and that missing piece still resembles intent. Which leaves the durable questions that walk beside the case. Why that route? Why that slowing? Why that autopsy there and not here? Why those photographs and not others? Why that wallet, that alias, that theater arrest, that immaculate bullet, that nightclub owner stepping into a police basement at the most critical moment? Line the answers up and they still won't salute together. But the pattern they draw on the ground looks less like accident than like a plan viewed from above, a plan that did not require perfection, only momentum, confusion, and a narrative ready in a folder to be stamped and released. The official report gave the country something firm to hold. The unanswered details keep slipping through the fingers that clutch it. Between them lies the space where doubt lives, and in that space the idea of a setup endures, not proven beyond all doubt, but tested by so many doubts that it outlasts the tidier tale. There is also the strange prelude in Mexico City, a thread that looks frayed no matter which end you pick up. Weeks before Dallas, Oswald supposedly visited the Cuban and Soviet missions, argued loudly, demanded visas, and left behind a trail of paperwork and phone transcripts. Photographs released later did not match his face. Tape recordings of calls were said to exist and then were said not to. The version of Oswald that walked those streets looked, to some eyes, like a man wearing his name as a costume. Back in New Orleans that summer, he handled for fair play for Cuba yet also flirted with anti-Castro elements. A foot in each bucket as if someone wanted both sets of footprints on the same floor. When local radio put him on air, he performed ideology like a monologue, all while moving in circles that overlapped with men who hated the very ideology he proclaimed. A protagonist who can play two roles is useful to a plot with multiple endings. Then there are the backyard photographs. Oswald posing with rifle and pistol, Marxist newspapers slung as props. To some they looked genuine, to others they carried the faint seams of cut and paste, the chin a touch too square, shadows that failed to agree on angles. The originals moved through hands and drawers, prints surfaced like messages in bottles. In a drama obsessed with identity, images themselves became suspects. Inside the depository, the physical scene leaves questions that have not faded. 3 shell casings by a 6th-floor window, a stack of book cartons arranged as if to frame a hide. A mail-order rifle with a scope misaligned enough to irritate a deer hunter. The path down the stairs to the 2nd-floor lunchroom timed and retimed in reenactments, each trial a contest between adrenaline and gravity. The 2 minutes that matter are elastic. To make them fit, someone always has to sand seconds the way a carpenter shaves a door. Outside, the motorcade route draws curiosity. A last-minute turn onto Elm, a gentle but meaningful slowing near the knoll, a momentary compression of speed and angle that any marksman would admire. If you were building a kill box on a map, you might pick that geometry. If you were building a safe route, you would not. Watch the Secret Service on film and you see human beings, startled and brave. But you also see gaps. Agents waved off the rear platform moments earlier. The protection bubble thinned at precisely the wrong time. In the aftermath, agents wrestled the casket away from a county coroner who protested the removal. Rectitude gave way to rank. Procedure gave way to priority. Consider the Altgens photographs, slices of a second preserved by a pressman's reflex. People have found in those frames everything from bystanders who look like suspects to suspects who look like bystanders. A doorway figure became a Rorschach, identified and re-identified as Oswald and not Oswald, a debate less about pixels than about the hunger for certainty in a place where certainty would be very convenient. Acoustics entered the story years later, when researchers listened to a police dictabelt recording for impulses that might be gunshots. Charts mapped patterns, and for a season the possibility of a 4th shot glowed hot enough that a congressional committee admitted. Probable conspiracy. The science has been beaten and rebeaten since, but the episode left a residue. Even late data bends toward the idea that 3 is not the whole number. The House Select Committee on Assassinations, trying to stand on the shoulders of the Warren Commission without falling off, reopened the boxes and took new notes. It called witnesses again, called different experts, weighed mob ties and exile anger and intelligence operations with the caution of a tightrope walker. Its conclusion was a paradox, a probable conspiracy with no definitive cast list. Skeptics of the skeptics laughed. Skeptics of the official story nodded grimly. Probability was the most honest word anyone had dared to use. Drill down on the autopsy, and you find the oddly sparse photographs of the brain, the suggestion that the organ examined could not have belonged to a man with the described damage, the question of whether two examinations blurred into one record. The witnesses to the autopsy do not all tell the same tale. The positions of hands and clamps and incisions migrate from memory to memory like small boats in a shifting current. A small difference in a skull wound is not a small difference in an assassination narrative. It redirects the river. Parkland's emergency room offered its own chorus. Doctors describing a throat wound that looked like an entrance before it became an incision for a tracheotomy. A head wound that suggested frontal force. Voices that did not expect to be overruled by a future they could not see. When you put Dallas and Bethesda side by side, the mirror does not align. Travel further into the Tippett case. Shells and bullets were said to match and then were said to require more testing. Witnesses placed a man in a jacket that Oswald may or may not have been wearing. A wallet arrived like a calling card. The taxi route Oswald took got him near Th. Rooming house efficiently, but his next choices made less sense if escape was the only goal. Walking toward danger does not prove innocence, but it does not shout guilt. And what of the little things, details that would be footnotes in a tidy case but loom larger in this one? The rifle serial numbers argued over in memos. The paper bag allegedly used to carry a disassembled weapon, with fibers that line up too perfectly with the workplace. The paper-thin walls of the rooming house and a housekeeper's glimpsed impression. The neighbor who noticed, the coworker who didn't, the vendor who may have sold a Coke to a man whose timeline keeps shifting by half a minute. None of these is a pillar. Together they form a texture, rough where you expect smooth, curated where you expect random. Motive maps multiply. Some trace arrows to Havana and Miami, to exile groups that wanted Castro gone yesterday and viewed Kennedy's caution as betrayal. Others draw lines to Chicago and New Orleans, to bosses who resented the president's brother for bringing the law like a floodlight into rooms that preferred to stay dim. Still others sketch arrows to Langley, to men convinced that geopolitics required a steady hand and saw in youthful idealism a risk to the old arithmetic. A few even point inward at Dallas, where politics ran hot and the welcome had been cold. Each arrow alone is speculation, a field of arrows is a weather report. If you prefer a simpler explanation, you can say Oswald wanted to matter. He practiced with a rifle, he bought it under an alias, he brought it to work, he took a shot, and then the machinery of the state did the best it could in the storm. This version insists on chance working overtime, the bullet that behaved, the witnesses who misheard, the procedures that failed, the suspect whose path happened to intersect with every incriminating breadcrumb. That is a possible world. It is also a very demanding one. What lingers, after the arguments, is the sensation of choreography. The plaza, the angles, the slowing car, the shots, the flight to Parkland, the rush to Bethesda, the emergence of evidence, the elimination of the suspect, the report that sealed the case and the later report that pried it open again. It reads like a story with acts and curtains, like a production that went up on time even if the dress rehearsal was ragged. And if there was a production, then someone wrote it. You can populate that writer's room however you like. Mobsters with grudges, spies with budgets, politicians with ambitions, soldiers with plans, true believers with feverish certainty that the nation needed a different captain. The exact mixture is less important than the unavoidable flavor, intent. But intent alone does not move a bullet, people do. People who understand routes, radios, vantage points. People who can position assets and then step back. People who know which documents to file and which to misplace. People who can look into a camera afterward and sound very sure, because sounding sure is sometimes as powerful as being sure. Half a century on, the case is an X-ray of the American appetite for explanations. We want the one bold line that solves the picture, or the one chaotic splash that says there was nothing to solve. Dallas refuses both. It offers instead overlapping transparencies that never quite align. You can see through each one, and something in the composite will always be blurry. So you return to the beginning, a crisp morning, a smiling man in a limousine, a plaza that felt like an amphitheater, A handful of seconds that reordered a century. The riddle has not quieted, and perhaps it never will. Indeed,